Hello and welcome to Press TV's debate. I'm Marzia Hashemi. Thanks so much for being with us. Well, Turkey has troops in both Iraq and Syria and say they are there to fight against the terrorists. However, both the Iraqi government and the Syrian government have demanded that Turkish troops be removed from their sovereign territories. Now, Turkey is pushing deeper into Syria, but the question is Ankara fighting against Daesh? Or is it trying to overthrow the elected governments of both Iraq and Syria? Well, stay with us as we take a look at the situation and what it all could mean. I'd like to welcome my guest to the program. Out of Beirut, political commentator Ms. Marwa Osman, and out of Istanbul, Deputy Chairman, Turkish Patriotic Party, Mr. Yunus. Thank you so much for being with us. Let's start this off in Istanbul. And Mr. Soner, in your perspective, why has the Turkish Parliament once again extended this mandate?
There is a broad consensus in the Turkish Parliament about the necessity of this operation first to maintain the Turkish and the Syrian territorial integrity. This is a broad consensus among all groups except the PKK-connected People's Democratic Party. And there is a second consensus arising that this operation also will lead Turkey to get new and better ties with Syria as well. But above all, in Turkey, everyone now feels the necessity and the importance of maintaining the Syrian territorial integrity and national unity. So this is the basic aim of the operation.
Sir, let me interrupt just something, Mr. Soner, something that you've just said. You said that with the extension of this mandate, I want to make sure I understand what you're saying, with the extension of this mandate, then actually this will help improve relations between Turkey and Syria. Is that what you said? And if so, can you expand and explain on what you mean exactly?
Exactly. When you watch carefully, then you will see that the government here in Turkey is not at all speaking of overthrowing the government in Syria anymore. They had been on that line, but they are not speaking of that anymore, and this is right so. Now, everyone here in Turkey is focused on the Syrian territorial integrity, and I will mention that in our perception in Turkey, the Turkish Ankara and Damascus have never been so close to each other. So this military intervention against ISIS on the one hand and the YPG on the other hand has brought Turkey in a deep conflict against the United States, in a deep conflict against the US, and it has strengthened the ties of Ankara with Moscow and has opened the way to re-establishing ties with Damascus as well.
All right. Let me turn to Beirut. Stay with me, sir. Let me turn and get Ms. Osman in on this discussion. Your take on what our guests have said, that actually these actions help to solidify relations between Turkey and Syria and distance the Turks from the United States. How do you see it?
Well, first of all, I'd like to ask our guest, what does he mean by Syrian territorial integrity? I didn't understand the term there. And then again, when we talk about the Turkish government or Turkish parliament prolonging the stay of their troops or letting them for another 13 months to get involved into the Syrian crisis, I believe that unless they are asked by the Syrian government to do so, it is a blatant aggression against the sovereignty of the Syrian state. There's no other explanation for that. This has been the case ever since the crisis started in Syria, before even the first soldier, the Turkish soldier, put his foot inside of Syrian soil. It started when Turkey opened its border for infiltrators to get into Syrian territory, which expanded the terrorist organizations inside of Syria. That's not our discussion now, but let us focus on what this mandate means and why it is being pushed now. First of all, it is the first bill that was passed after the parliament convened, and it is also passed it will allow foreign force usage to Turkish air bases. That is the most important part of the entire bill there. We have to think about why is it being prolonged now. It is being prolonged now because the Turkish air bases are being used by foreign forces like the US, like France, and like Britain to launch airstrikes, not against ISIS as we saw 2 weeks ago, but against the Syrian Arab Army in Deir Zor. That was a big mistake that was committed. But yet again, it was committed using resources of the Turkish NATO ally. Now, when we talk, when you're guest in Istanbul said that there is some sort of a tie being now let's say reknotted between Damascus and Ankara. I do agree with that, especially after the coup d'etat, the failed coup d'etat that happened in Turkey and Ankara. I do believe that, especially when the Russians are being mediators to try and broker some sort of a tie again between both governments. But again, if there is no invitation from Damascus for the Turks to get involved with their soldiers within Syrian territory, then it is not saving the territorial integrity of Syria. It is an aggression. It is an incursion against Syrian
What about that, Mr. Soner, what our guest in Beirut has said? If they have not been asked, if the Turks have not been asked by Damascus to actually enter the country in the way that they have, wouldn't you see that as more an aggressive act than actually trying to protect the sovereignty of Syria?
As deputy chairman of the Patriotic Party, I have been traveling to Damascus since the crisis began several times, and we have met there with foreign ministry officials and government officials. They always confirmed one thing, that what the West is pressuring for is to turn Syria into a kind of federation. A federation that involves a so-called Kurdish zone in the north of Syria, and for the rest of the country a kind of sectarian division, including a kind of IS entity. So that is the position of the West, and now Turkey, when entering into north of Syria, is fighting exactly against this plan of turning Syria into a federation, and this is what I refer to maintaining Syria's territorial integrity, not allowing that there is an entity built in the north of Syria, a so-called Kurdish entity. Watch out, this entity today is not defended by Kurdish military or Kurdish groups. It is defended by raising American flags. So I think we should be really careful about speaking about the nature of this intervention. The considered zone here in the north of Syria, unfortunately, and also due to Turkey's initially wrong politics, has become a strip dominated by pro-American forces, above all the YPG. And the US has been delivering weapons there, and the US officials have been visiting this region. So de facto, this zone is now not under Syrian government's control. And it is Turkey's right, undisputed right, to fight against the prolongation of the PKK in this region.
Well, isn't it ironic, though, Mr. Soner, isn't it ironic you yourself have said,
aim is to
you yourself just said, excuse me, sir, you yourself just said about the wrong policies initially of the Turkish government actually in supporting, trying to overthrow the Syrian government, and now midstream they have changed their mind. But of course that area would not have been destabilized had entities like Turkey, like Saudi Arabia, like the United States and others, if they had not destabilized it to begin with.
Thank you.
Exactly. No doubt about that, no question about that, that the Turkish government's policy since the beginning of the crisis was dominated by the United States and has been against the national interests of Turkey itself.
Okay, let me get Ms. Osman back in here. Myra Osman, go ahead. I think you seem to want to comment on what our guest in Istanbul has said. Go ahead now.
Can we just put the dots where they belong there? You say, sir, that it is the complete right of Ankara to defend itself and enter into Syrian territory to defend the Turkish soil from any incoming terrorist actions. Then, with that logic, I believe that the Syrian army should have bombed every last Turkish tank and jet fighter that entered into Syrian airspace and Syrian territory since the beginning of 2011, which made way for terrorists like Daesh and other organizations to flourish inside of Syria, and especially after the latest, which happened in August, when Jarablus is now under the Turkish occupation, which is a Syrian town. What can you call that? How is it a right for Turkey to do that without coordinating with the Syrian army? Now, I do believe what you are coming from, what you are saying from, that the West does want to break Syria into a federation, and they want to involve the Kurds in that, and that is why everybody now believes that Turkey is getting involved and getting on the train of fighting terrorism because of the growth of the Kurdish possibility of having their own autonomous state inside of Syria, which most probably would also outgrow itself from Syria into Turkey, and that is a big no-no for Turkey. I do understand that, but isn't it a bit late for Ankara to now just acknowledge that it is an imperialist war against Syria, and this war was made in order to spread chaos into the entire Middle East? Now Mr. Erdogan woke up to the fact that Turkey is also targeted by this war against Syria after 6 years where he helped Daesh enter into Syria and then helped them steal the resources, the oil resources of Syria, and then sell it to other countries. I believe that this mistake can be reversed, but it's going to take big time for the Syrian government to take another confident step towards brokering more ties with Ankara. And the second thing, it should stop right now with the involvement of the soldiers, the Turkish soldiers, on Syrian soil without the acknowledgement and the okay from the Syrian government. Other than that, it is occupation, it is blatant aggression.
What about that, Mr. Soner? Why doesn't, if really the Turkish government has changed its mind and actually now understands, as our guest in Beirut talked about, the imperialist plot, why doesn't it formally request permission then from Damascus to actually have their troops on Syrian territory to help the Syrian government take out the terrorists, if that's the case?
Well, first of all, I'm not a spokesperson of the government.
Your perspective, sir. You're an analyst. Just your perspective.
Everyone here in Turkey, here in Ankara, in Turkey, everyone has a consensus about the fact that there has been a consensus before this operation between Ankara and Moscow. So the Turkish government takes it for granted that Moscow has informed Damascus and has organized their approval as well. Well, this is not an approval written on paper and signed by governments, which is something that will be happening very soon, but not yet. But this is the perception. And of course, it is a turn of politics in Turkey, which is also hard to explain to their own, to the government's followers here, to change from the former position of fighting against President Assad now to a kind of undeclared cooperation. But this undeclared cooperation will happen, and it will be realized also soon in public. This is a matter of months that we are already facing news about Syrian and Turkish delegations meeting here and there, unconfirmed news, but every time more and more. And I think the tide has turned, and this has to do with an internal change here in Turkey. The beginning of the fight against the PKK here in Turkey, inside Turkey, has forced the government to recalculate its foreign relations as well. Because when you fight against the PKK, which is directly supported by the United States, then you have to reconsider your regional alignments and regional coalitions. And you face that if you want to fight terrorism inside Turkey successfully, then you have to enter into a coalition with Russia, Iran, Iraq, and at the end of the day, also with Syria. And this is what's going to happen. Okay. And this will happen on the ground. This will happen by creating the facts. And I think it is just the American position to criticize lack of UN consensus and lack of this and that, and also their position to criticize that this has happened too late. Well, the Syrian government, I can assure you, is not interested in if it's happening too late or too soon.
Okay, let me get Beirut back in on this. Ms. Osman, your take on what our guest in Istanbul has said concerning a consensus that he says exists now between Turkey and Russia that they assume that had been okayed by Syria.
There is a consensus towards targeting Daesh, ISIS, and other terrorist organizations and getting involved in the war against terror. Yes, there is consensus towards that notion, but there was not a consensus towards Turkey taking Jarablus, and that operation was made very clear by Russia that it was not okay and it was not coordinated with Russia. We read a lot about it from reports and statements coming from the Kremlin. But again, when we talk about the rearrangement of the foreign policy of the Turkish side of Ankara, this should have been, I agree that whether it happens now or before, it's not a question, it's a matter of happening and coordinating. But this kind of a foreign policy should have taken a turn once Turkey saw that its own neighbor and by far ally in the Middle East, Syria, is being attacked by NATO and by the US. They shouldn't have waited until the time where the US, obviously, as always, stood by the Kurds against any Turkish foreign policy for them to rearrange their plans. But again, when we talk about what is going on now on the ground, we don't want to forget, and we don't want to forget mentioning specifically what the Turkish government is still doing in the northern side of Syria, specifically opening the gates for specific terrorist organizations which are labeled by the West as moderate, and they prove to be not non-moderate at all. But they are still opening them waves of aid. They are still giving them weapons. They are giving them even not only aid and weapons. We also saw reports and videos of them coordinating with them, sitting with them in the councils where there is Turkish flags on Syrian soil and Turkish.
Okay,
and
I don't have a lot of time. I'm turn back to Istanbul. What about that? What about that, Mr. Soner? What Ms. Osman has just talked about the areas that still that she's saying, and others are also, that the Turks are still allowing the terrorists clear passage and still helping them.
Sure. Well, watch out. For example, take the Free Syrian Army, an armed group that has been fighting against the Syrian government since the beginning of the crisis. Now, at least in part, in the north of Syria, turns its weapons against partly Daesh and partly YPG. And it's turning its weapons against US Special Forces on the ground, partly at least. So this is the influence of Turkey, exactly. Formerly, anti-governmental armed groups, terror groups, now turn their weapons against US Special Forces. And this is a very, very positive sign. This is exactly a small step towards maintaining the Syrian national unity.
All right. Okay. Ms. Osman, I'll let you in the program. 1 minute. 1 minute. You can go ahead with closing comments. Go ahead, ma'am.
I'm sorry. If Ankara wants to actually try and get a U-turn or do a U-turn, as your guest is implying there, I believe that these should start by trying to coordinate openly with the Syrian government and putting aside whatever moderate rebels they are calling, because these moderate rebels will turn against them once the funding stops. I assure you that they did feel that in Ain Arab, which was called as Kobani, and other areas. So they should work with the Syrian government as soon as possible, coordinate with the Russian Air Force as soon as possible, which would make it very much easier to try and stop terrorism that would infiltrate and enter into Turkey again.
Okay. And on that note, we're out of time. I appreciate both of you being with us. Out of Beirut, political commentator Ms. Marwa Osman, and out of Istanbul, Deputy Chairman, Turkish Patriotic Party, Mr. Yunus Soner.